Pilot asks black man to prove his ticket. He shocks crew when he shows his airline ownership card. A storm of whispers swept through Gate 12 at John F. Kennedy International Airport that morning. Passengers craned their necks, drawn by the raised voices near the boarding counter. Tensions flared as a seasoned pilot, known for his crisp uniform and stern demeanor, pointed accusingly at a tall black man clutching a sleek leather carry-on. No one knew the man's name yet, only that he apparently needed to prove he had a right to board. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire crew and every witness around. Little did the pilot know he was about to confront someone who had the ultimate power to ground him forever. It was a crisp spring morning at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The sun's pale rays glinted off the wide stretch of runway as planes taxied in and out, a seemingly endless ballet of steel birds guided by fluorescent-vested ground crews. Inside Terminal 8, a throng of travelers bustled through security lines, sipped coffee in departure lounges, and tapped away on smartphones while they waited for their flights. Among them was David Collins, a tall, athletic black man in his early 30s, whose measured gaze took in the frantic energy around him. David had arrived early, passing through the TSA pre-check line with little fuss. He wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, dark slacks and polished loafers. Even in casual attire, he exuded an aura of quiet confidence and assurance that came from years of overcoming the odds. Despite his relative youth, David had made a name for himself in the world of tech startups and venture capital, building a reputation for fairness, humility, and generosity. But that wasn't the only part of his life that remained largely hidden from the public eye. His close friend and personal assistant, Marcus Bryant, walked alongside him. Marcus had been with David for nearly a decade, starting as an intern at one of David's first fledgling tech companies. Over the years, their bond had grown, shaped by challenges, triumphs, and an unwavering loyalty. Now, Marcus helped manage David's hectic schedule, which included everything from philanthropic galas to high-stakes investment meetings. They ambled toward the American Airlines flagship lounge, both ready for a moment of respite before their flight to Los Angeles. David had business to attend to in LA, meetings with potential partners, final touches on an upcoming philanthropic initiative, and, quietly, a board meeting. Because what few people knew, outside of a select circle of investors and executives, was that David had recently become the largest individual shareholder of an airline, a detail that rarely came up in casual conversation, but now governed a significant part of his life. As they approached the lounge's gleaming doors, the aroma of fresh coffee and pastries wafted out to greet them. Marcus glanced at David and quipped, "Remember, you've got that Zoom call with the Japanese investors at 3 p.m. Pacific, plus the meeting with the charity in Beverly Hills around 6. Busy day ahead." David flashed a smile. "We'll manage. I just need a quick breather and maybe a cappuccino." They stepped inside. The lounge spread before them in swaths of modern comfort, plush seating, polished marble floors, and soft ambient lighting. Clusters of well-dressed passengers tapped away at laptops or flipped through newspapers. David and Marcus found 2 seats by a broad window that overlooked the tarmac. For a moment, David lost himself in the movement of planes taking off, that thrilling split second when wheels left the ground and soared into open sky. As they waited, David took out his phone. He scrolled through emails and finance reports, occasionally pausing to respond. Marcus, seated next to him, pored over David's itinerary for the coming days. So engrossed were they in their tasks, neither noticed the flight crew that entered the lounge behind them. Captain Eric Huxley strode into the American Airlines flagship lounge, accompanied by 2 flight attendants, Sarah Delgado and Lucas Winfield, who would be serving in the business and first-class cabins that day. Captain Huxley was a veteran pilot with over 25 years of experience under his belt. He prided himself on discipline and strict attention to protocol, some said a bit too strict, especially when it came to people he deemed suspicious. Huxley's uniform was immaculate navy blue blazer with 4 gold stripes on each cuff, pressed trousers, and shining epaulets. Yet, despite his professional veneer, a perpetual scowl lingered on his brow. He was the kind of man who believed that respect was earned by rank and that those below his station had better step in line or face consequences. Over the years, his stern approach had garnered him both admirers who praised his commitment to safety and punctuality and detractors who whispered he was rude or even prejudiced. Sarah, in her early 30s, had a more open-minded view of the world and often tried to smooth tensions between passengers and her hot-tempered superior. Lucas, a few years younger and newly promoted to first class, watched carefully for cues from both the pilot and Sarah. As Huxley surveyed the lounge, he instantly spotted David and Marcus, though he had no reason to single them out yet. In truth, his eyes were drawn by David's commanding posture and the expensive watch gleaming at his wrist. Something about David's presence unsettled the pilot, though he couldn't have articulated why. "Let's grab a seat," Sarah said. "We've got a little time before we need to prep the aircraft. It's a 777 today, flight AAA-17 to LAX. Huxley's gaze flicked to Sarah. "Right. Let's make it quick, Delgado. I want to be at the gate early. We don't want to risk a delay." They took seats not far from David and Marcus, who were still immersed in their phones. Sarah quietly signaled to a passing lounge attendant for coffees. Every so often, Huxley's gaze darted back to David. Though the lounge was half full, he seemed fixated on that one passenger. Sarah noticed her captain's wandering stare and tried to engage him in conversation about the flight plan, hoping to distract him. Marcus rose to stretch his legs and stepped to the lounge's refreshment area for a pastry. On his way back, he accidentally brushed past the flight attendant Lucas, who was returning to his seat with a cup of tea. "Oh, excuse me," Marcus said, apologizing softly as he steadied Lucas's cup to prevent a spill. Lucas offered a quick smile, his brown eyes warm. "No worries. That was my fault for not watching where I was going." They exchanged polite nods, and Marcus returned to David. David took the pastry from Marcus and thanked him. A moment later, David's phone buzzed an email from the board of directors for the airline. A board meeting was scheduled for the following week in Dallas at the airline's corporate headquarters. The meeting's purpose, to finalize a new set of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Ironically enough, David couldn't help but grin at the timing. "If only people knew," he muttered under his breath. "What's up?" Marcus asked between bites of his own pastry. David shrugged. "Board meeting in Dallas next week. I guess we're moving forward with the new training program." Marcus snickered. "It's about time. You've been pushing for that since you took your seat on the board." David nodded. As a major shareholder, he had advocated for better racial sensitivity training for flight crews, improved recruitment of pilots and cabin staff from diverse backgrounds, and more robust scholarships for minority youth aspiring to aviation careers. The recent corporate climate was at least somewhat receptive. David's stake had given him significant leverage, but changing minds and hearts took time. From a few seats away, Captain Huxley watched the interchange between the two men with an inscrutable expression. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he registered the comfortable way they spoke, the hint of importance in David's calm, measured tone. Something about the dynamic rubbed him the wrong way. Huxley liked to be the alpha presence in a room, especially around travelers. Seeing someone else command that subtle aura of respect, especially someone who didn't fit Huxley's picture of a wealthy traveler, rankled him. Sarah finished her coffee. "We should probably head to the gate," she said, looking pointedly at Huxley. With a curt nod he rose. Lucas followed suit, picking up the group's garbage to drop at a nearby trash can. Sarah nodded politely to David and Marcus as she passed, a friendly but reserved gesture. David offered a small nod in return, not realizing that the man in uniform behind her was eyeing him with silent scrutiny. Gate 12 swelled with passengers waiting to board Flight AA-17 to Los Angeles. A line was already forming near the ticket scanners, and an overhead announcement indicated a slight delay due to a routine mechanical inspection. David and Marcus waited patiently, leaning against a nearby pillar and chatting about the upcoming meetings in La. A large digital screen overhead rotated flight details in bright letters: AA-17 JFK LAX. Depart 10:30 am Gate 12 status delayed. Estimated departure 10:45 and Marcus glanced at his watch. "We've got 15 minutes or so. Want to get in line?" David nodded. They made their way into the priority boarding queue behind a few other first-class passengers. David's seat was 2A, near the front of the business cabin, with Marcus in 2B meanwhile. Captain Huxley stood at the boarding door, arms folded. He was accompanied by a gate agent, Rebecca Liu, who was scanning tickets. The pilot liked to make a personal show of greeting certain passengers, particularly those he deemed important or, at times, those he deemed suspicious. With a subtle shift of his posture, he prepared himself for the two men he had spotted earlier in the lounge. A few other travelers boarded without issue. Then David and Marcus approached. Marcus handed over both boarding passes to the gate agent, who scanned them quickly. "Have a great flight, Mr. Collins, Mr. Bryant," Rebecca said, smiling politely. Before they could proceed, Huxley stepped forward, an artificial smile etched on his face. "Gentlemen," he said, "are you traveling together?" David glanced up, a bit surprised that the pilot was addressing them directly. "Yes. We're on a business trip." Huxley's smile tightened. "I see. May I see your tickets again, please?" Rebecca, the gate agent, looked momentarily confused. She had literally just scanned the tickets, confirming their validity. "Captain, I've already checked them," she said, trying to hide the uncertainty in her voice. But Huxley ignored her, focusing on David and Marcus. "Just a quick verification. These seats are quite expensive, as you know, and we've had issues in the past with, seat mix-ups. I'm sure you understand." A hush fell over the immediate area. Passengers behind David and Marcus craned their necks, curious. David felt the color drain from his face, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. This was unusual, even if not outright confrontational yet. Marcus handed over the boarding passes once more. Huxley examined them slowly, as though expecting to find something amiss. Finally, he gave a curt nod, but his expression remained skeptical. "You can proceed," he said, stepping aside. David took a breath and walked toward the jet bridge, with Marcus behind him. The mood had subtly shifted. That single interaction had left a sour taste in David's mouth, and he felt the weight of stares at his back. Inside the Boeing 777, the business cabin was arranged in 1-2-1 seating, each row offering wide, comfortable seats that reclined fully for longer flights. David and Marcus found their places in row 2. David stowed his carry-on overhead, and Marcus slid his beneath the seat in front of him. A flight attendant, Sarah Delgado, greeted them warmly, offering a choice of water, orange juice, or champagne. "I'm Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you in business class today," she said with a bright smile. "Please let me know if you need anything." "Thank you," David replied, politely returning her smile. Marcus selected a glass of orange juice, while David opted for water. As they settled, Sarah moved on to the next passengers, welcoming them with the same friendly professionalism. Up in the cockpit, Captain Huxley was finalizing pre-flight checks with his co-pilot, First Officer Karen Oliphant. Karen was a seasoned aviator herself, albeit with fewer years than Huxley. She had sensed her captain's sour mood, but kept her focus on the checklists. She knew better than to question him before takeoff. Huxley did not appreciate second-guessing. Despite the mechanical inspection earlier, the plane was cleared for departure. Overhead bins clicked shut, seatbelts latched, and the cabin crew completed safety checks. Once everyone was seated, the airplane door was sealed and pushback commenced. David leaned back, exhaling slowly. He tried to brush off the odd confrontation at the gate. As the plane taxied, an undercurrent of tension still hummed in the background of his mind. 40 minutes later, flight AA-17 was at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dimmed. Sarah and Lucas began meal service in business class, moving smoothly between the aisles with carts of warm towels, drinks, and gourmet dishes. Most passengers appeared to relax into the flight. Some read newspapers or e-books. Others watched the in-flight entertainment. David scrolled through the flight's Wi-Fi, checking emails to keep up with urgent messages. Marcus studied a spreadsheet on his laptop. Every so often, they exchanged thoughts on upcoming meetings. Occasionally, David's mind returned to the moment at the gate. He was used to dealing with microaggressions, especially in high-end environments that were not always accustomed to seeing men of color in such privileged spaces. But the pilot's direct intervention felt more blatant than usual. Halfway through lunch service, just as Sarah was clearing plates, Captain Huxley stepped out of the cockpit to use the lavatory. On his way, he paused in the business class cabin. Passengers watched idly, not thinking much of it. Pilots often did walk-throughs, but David stiffened as Huxley's gaze locked on him. Without preamble, Huxley approached David's seat. The pilot's voice was low but tinged with challenge. "Mr. Collins, is it? Are you enjoying the flight?" David set aside his tray. "It's fine, Captain." "Thank you." Huxley nodded slowly. "Good, good. I just wanted to make sure everything is in order. We had a few issues with fraudulently obtained tickets last month." He paused, his eyes darting between David and Marcus. "I trust you both are comfortable?" Marcus's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, allowing David to respond. David managed a tight-lipped smile. "Everything is perfectly fine. Thank you for your concern." Sarah, sensing the tension, hovered nearby, uncertain whether to intervene. Other passengers in the cabin took note, eyebrows rose, and curious gazes lingered. After a moment that stretched painfully, Huxley nodded again and finally turned away, heading toward the galley, presumably on his way to the cockpit lavatory. Marcus muttered under his breath, "What's his problem?" David just shook his head. "Let's not escalate," he said softly. "It's a short flight. We'll be off in LA soon." But Sarah was not about to let it slide. She approached after Huxley vanished down the aisle. "Is everything all right, Mr. Collins? Mr. Bryant? I apologize for the interruption. If you need anything, please just let me know." David's features softened at her genuine concern. "Thanks, Sarah. We're okay. Appreciate it." She nodded and busied herself with clearing trays, hoping the pilot's odd behavior wouldn't escalate further. An hour later, somewhere over the Midwest, the flight encountered a patch of turbulence. David had just dozed off. He jerked awake as the plane bucked, overhead lights flickered, and seatbelt signs blared on. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing everyone to remain seated and fasten belts. Marcus glanced at David. "Well, at least it's not too bad." Indeed, after a few moments, the jostling eased and the plane steadied. However, the tension in the cabin, stoked by the pilot's earlier behavior, lingered like a dull ache. Sarah and Lucas strapped into their jump seats until the seatbelt sign turned off. Then they resumed service, offering water and calming smiles. Everything was back to normal, at least on the surface. Up front, Captain Huxley guided the plane through the turbulence with a steady hand. He was, despite his personality, a skilled pilot. His co-pilot, Karen, broke the silence with a concerned tone. "Captain, everything seems stable now. We should have clear skies soon." "Good," he replied curtly, scanning the flight path. Karen hesitated, then added, "Sir, I've noticed you," but Huxley cut her off. "Focus on the flight, Oliphant," he snapped. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, but Karen returned her gaze to the instruments. A few minutes later, Huxley unbuckled his shoulder harness. "I'm going to check on something," he said. Karen exhaled quietly as he left. She had no idea what personal vendetta or suspicion was driving Huxley to repeatedly check on that passenger, but she recognized that it wasn't standard protocol. She could only hope the pilot's bizarre behavior wouldn't escalate to a full-blown incident. Captain Huxley walked down the aisle once again, this time heading straight for David's seat with a determined stride. Passengers glanced up, sensing the electricity in the air. Marcus tensed, bracing for another awkward encounter. David, flipping through a magazine, looked up. "Captain," he said, forcing politeness. Huxley crossed his arms. "I've been reviewing the passenger manifest, Mr. Collins. The first see you purchased these tickets at a significant discount. Care to explain how you managed that?" A wave of indignation flooded David's chest. He prided himself on composure, but this was verging on outright harassment. "I used my frequent flyer miles and some promotional codes," David replied calmly. "Everything was done through legitimate channels." "And you, Mr. Bryant?" Huxley pressed, shifting his gaze. "Traveling on miles as well." Marcus stared back, his temper flaring. "Captain, I don't see how that's any of your concern. Our tickets are valid, as your gate agent confirmed." At this point, a few other business-class passengers spoke up. "Leave them alone, we're trying to rest," came one voice. "Captain, is there a problem?" asked another, uncertain if there was a security issue. Huxley stood tall, ignoring the peanut gallery. He seemed fixated on David, as though trying to find a crack in his story. David inhaled slowly, carefully choosing his words. "Captain, if you suspect anything improper, you should contact the airline's corporate security or the authorities upon landing. Otherwise, kindly allow me and the other passengers to enjoy the flight without further disruption." A muscle twitched in Huxley's jaw. He looked as though he wanted to say something else, but Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "Captain, I need to speak with you regarding passenger meal requests." She appeared behind him, her face flushed but resolute. Reluctantly, Huxley turned and followed her a short distance away, out of earshot of passengers. Sarah lowered her voice, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "Sir, your repeated questioning of Mr. Collins is making passengers uncomfortable. If there's a legitimate security concern, we should follow protocol. Otherwise, you're risking a complaint that could escalate." Huxley's lips thinned. "Mind your own job, Delgado. I've seen all kinds of stunts on these flights. We have to remain vigilant." Sarah's gaze hardened. "With all due respect, Captain, I've dealt with suspicious passenger incidents before. This isn't that. He's done nothing but show valid tickets and behave respectfully. The entire cabin is noticing. Please, for the sake of the flight, let it go." Huxley glared at her for a beat, then spun on his heel and returned to the cockpit. Sarah closed her eyes and released a shaky breath. She was pushing the limits of how far she could challenge a pilot in front of passengers. But it was necessary. She refused to stand by while a passenger was harassed, based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. Minutes later, David's phone vibrated in his pocket. Though airplane mode was officially required, Wi-Fi calling features often worked if the flight offered in-flight connectivity. Glancing at the caller ID, he saw it was Gerald Peterson, the airline's chief legal officer. "Surprised but curious," David answered quietly, mindful of the cabin setting. "Gerald, this is unexpected," David said under his breath, turning slightly away from other passengers. David, I got wind of a situation on your flight. Something about repeated ticket checks by the pilot. A colleague texted me, Gerald replied. Even over the patchy connection, David could sense the man's unease. Is everything okay? David sighed. I'm fine, but the pilot, Captain Huxley, keeps singling me out. I haven't revealed who I am. I'm trying to keep the peace. Gerald was silent for a moment. This is exactly the sort of scenario we've been trying to avoid. Look, David, your presence on that flight is known to a few senior people. They're worried about reputational damage if word gets out that a major shareholder was profiled by one of our own pilots. I'm not telling you what to do, but if it escalates, make sure you have documentation. David nodded, his jaw tight. I'm not looking to cause trouble. But if he pushes me again, I might have to disclose my involvement with the airline. Gerald's tone was resolute. Do what you have to do, David. We support you. And, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this is happening. The call ended. David slipped his phone into his pocket, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, disappointment, and a faint sadness that such incidents were still so common, even in supposedly progressive environments. Marcus, who had overheard David's side of the conversation, leaned in. That was from corporate, wasn't it? David gave a curt nod. They know what's happening. They're worried. Let's see if this pilot backs off now, Marcus said grimly. David nodded, gazing out the window at the endless sky. He was not the kind of man to flaunt power, but if Huxley persisted, David was prepared to bring down the hammer. Just as tensions threatened to boil over, the flight crew announced an unexpected diversion due to severe weather over parts of the West. Flight A-17 would land in Denver International Airport to refuel and wait out the storm system. The news was met with groans and sighs from weary passengers, all anxious to reach Los Angeles. The plane landed smoothly in Denver around mid-afternoon, local time. Once on the ground, the captain informed passengers that they could deplane if they wished, but they must remain close to the gate for updates. David and Marcus opted to stretch their legs in the terminal. They found a quiet seating area near the windows, away from the bustle of the gates. Marcus scrolled the news on his phone, while David sipped from a bottled water he'd purchased. Unbeknownst to them, Captain Huxley was also prowling the terminal, presumably to get a coffee and clear his head. He spotted David and Marcus. Without hesitation, he marched over, his face set in a grim line. "Gentlemen," he said, forcing a veneer of politeness, "I noticed you left the aircraft. Are you planning to reboard, or did you find an alternative flight?" David set down his water. "We're continuing on your flight, Captain. Why wouldn't we?" Huxley shrugged. "Just making sure you're not up to anything. One can never be too careful." At that, Marcus couldn't restrain himself. "Captain, I don't know what your issue is, but we're legitimate passengers. Enough is enough." Huxley leaned in, his tone quietly menacing. "Look, I don't know who you are or what strings you pulled to get those seats so cheaply, but I've got a job to do, ensuring the safety of my aircraft. If that means verifying every detail, so be it." A light flickered in David's eyes, but he kept his voice measured. "Fine, Captain. Verify all you want, but you should know that if you continue this line of harassment, there will be consequences." Huxley smirked. "Is that a threat?" David shook his head. "No. It's a promise of accountability." Huxley bristled, about to retort, when a voice over the loudspeaker announced that passengers should reboard for the final leg to LAX. People began streaming back into the jet bridge. The pilot finally turned and walked away, leaving David and Marcus to share a frustrated look. Back on board, the flight prepared for departure from Denver. The storm in the west was moving eastward, so they would skirt around it en route to Los Angeles. The cabin lights dimmed, and the engines roared back to life as the 777 took off again, slicing through the evening sky. As soon as they reached cruising altitude, David's phone buzzed once more, a text message from a friend at the airline's corporate office. It read, "We've got your back. Don't let Huxley push you around." Attached was a link to an incident report form. David almost chuckled at the irony. He, a major owner, receiving an official channel to file a complaint like any other passenger. He wasn't sure if the pilot realized just how precarious his situation might become. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, First Officer Karen Oliphant mustered the courage to speak her mind. "Captain, if I may, we've diverted once already, and this flight is behind schedule. Maybe it's best to keep interactions with passengers to a minimum, unless absolutely necessary." Huxley shot her a glance. "I appreciate your concern, Oliphant, but I'll handle the passengers as I see fit." Karen bit her lip. She suspected Captain Huxley might be harboring personal biases. Over the years, she had seen him single out other passengers, though none with this level of persistence. She recalled a rumor that Huxley had once run into trouble over racially charged remarks at a pilot union meeting, though the details were murky. Outside the cockpit, Sarah Delgado did her best to keep the cabin calm. She offered David and Marcus a sincere apology for the pilot's behavior, discreetly when Huxley was out of earshot. She also refilled their drinks, brought blankets, and tried to make the rest of the flight as comfortable as possible. For a moment, David relaxed, lulled by the thrum of the engines. He thought about the path that had led him here. Born in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, he was raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support him and his younger sister. Scholarships and part-time jobs got him through college, where he excelled in business and computer science. After launching a successful startup that revolutionized peer-to-peer delivery apps, he sold it and moved into venture capital. His philanthropic efforts extended to youth programs in underserved areas. When the opportunity arose to invest in the airline, an airline that had ironically never had a black CEO or a robust diversity initiative, David jumped at the chance. Over time, he acquired more shares until he became the largest single shareholder, though the day-to-day operations were still in the hands of the CEO and senior executives. He was determined to bring about cultural change from within. Yet here he was, still being treated with suspicion by one of his own pilots, presumably because of how he looked rather than who he was. The thought burned him, stirring both anger and a quiet resolve. The rest of the flight proceeded without overt incident, though the tension was never far from the surface. Passengers sensed something unusual was happening, but aside from a few questioning looks, most tried to sleep or watch movies. Finally, the city lights of Los Angeles came into view, shimmering in the distance against the Pacific coastline. The plane began its descent. Captain Huxley announced their approach over the intercom, his voice clipped. Some passengers exchanged relieved smiles. The long flight with its turbulence, diversion, and uncomfortable undercurrents was nearly over. Upon landing, the plane taxied to the gate at Los Angeles International Airport LAX. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood, gathering belongings from overhead bins. Sarah thanked people for flying and reminded them to check for personal items. David and Marcus waited calmly until most passengers had deplaned. They rose and collected their carry-ons, stepping into the aisle. At the door, Sarah offered a parting smile. "Have a wonderful stay in LA," she said softly, almost apologetically. Just then, Captain Huxley appeared, arms folded. He blocked the exit, preventing David and Marcus from fully stepping into the jet bridge. "Mr. Collins, a word before you go." David's patience had been worn thin over the entire flight. Marcus's hand trembled slightly on the handle of his luggage. Passengers behind them in line muttered in confusion, trying to exit. Lucas, the other flight attendant, gently gestured for passengers to move around the confrontation. "What is it now, Captain?" David asked in a measured voice. Huxley's eyes narrowed. "I've called airport security to verify your credentials. They should be here shortly. A ripple of shock passed through the remaining passengers. Some craned their necks to see what was happening, while others hurried past, not wanting to get involved. Sarah's face went pale. "Captain," she said, exasperated, "we're blocking the jet bridge." "This is highly irregular," Huxley cut her off. "Stand aside, Delgado. This is airline business." David's anger flared, but he forced himself to remain collected. "Captain, do you have any actual reason to suspect me of wrongdoing, besides whatever prejudice you might harbor?" Huxley's voice lowered dangerously. "Watch your tone, sir." In that moment, David decided enough was enough. He slipped his hand into the breast pocket of his blazer and withdrew a sleek card encased in protective plastic. The airline's logo glinted under the fluorescent lights. Underneath it, in bold text, it read, "David Collins, primary shareholder and board member." With a controlled gesture, David held the card up for Huxley to see. "Here's my proof, Captain. I think you'll find it more than covers any credential requirement." Captain Huxley stood rigid in the jet bridge, blocking David and Marcus from leaving the aircraft. The cacophony of passengers disembarking had died down to a low murmur. Only a few people lingered behind, curious eyes flitting from the pilot's imposing stance to the two men who had so far maintained a remarkable sense of calm. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows on the walls. David's grip on his leather carry-on tightened, his composure on the verge of cracking. Beside him, Marcus wore an expression that was equal parts indignation and disbelief. They had tolerated the pilot's scrutiny in flight, hoping to avoid drama in front of the other passengers. But Huxley had pushed this final confrontation too far, refusing to let them pass without yet another verification. Now, the tension was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. "All right, Captain," David said, his tone measured despite the anger brewing under the surface. "What exactly do you want from us?" Huxley, his usually confident stance slightly wavering, folded his arms over his crisp uniform. "I've already called airport security," he announced, raising his voice so that any nearby onlooker could hear. "We'll see if those tickets of yours are legitimate once and for all." In the cabin doorway, flight attendants Sarah Delgado and Lucas Winfield hovered, torn between their duty to respect the captain's authority and their empathy for David and Marcus. Sarah had witnessed every uncomfortable exchange during the flight. She knew how unfairly David had been treated. Yet, officially, she was subordinate to Huxley. Her eyes darted from the pilot to David, silently conveying an apology she could not fully express aloud. Almost on cue, two uniformed airport security officers strode into the jet bridge. Their footsteps echoed in the stillness. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter, but with a look of professional alertness. They surveyed the scene, the pilot blocking the exit, David and Marcus clearly impatient to leave, and a cluster of onlookers wearing confused or anxious expressions. "Someone requested passenger verification?" asked the taller officer, his voice echoing slightly. He glanced at Huxley, then at David and Marcus. At that moment, David decided he was done letting this man's bias dictate the narrative. He reached into his blazer's inner pocket and withdrew a sleek plastic card adorned with the airline's official logo. The card bore his name in bold letters, David Collins, primary shareholder and board member. He held it up, letting the overhead light reflect off the embossed seal. A hush fell, as if someone had sucked all the air out of the jet bridge. Huxley's eyes widened, the color draining from his face. Sarah let out a tiny gasp, and Lucas nearly dropped the pile of arrival forms in his hands. Even the security officers did a double take, exchanging a quick look of astonishment. You're, Huxley stammered, his bravado suddenly replaced with disorientation. This can't be. David met his gaze calmly. "You've never seen me before. I understand. But believe me, Captain, my identity is legitimate. I'm a major stakeholder in this airline and sit on its board of directors. An audible intake of breath swept through the small crowd. Marcus said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched in a grim half-smile. He took no pleasure in watching the pilot's pride crumble, yet it was undeniable that justice, or at least vindication, felt overdue. "Captain," Sarah whispered, placing a gentle hand on Huxley's shoulder, "I think this situation speaks for itself. Maybe we should step aside." Huxley looked like he wanted to disappear, but the security officers were already speaking, their professional composure unshaken. "Captain," one officer said firmly, "do you still require our assistance?" A hush lingered. Huxley opened and closed his mouth as if trying to form words, but only a strangled sound escaped. After a moment he shook his head. "No, no, that won't be necessary." "Very well," the officer replied, stepping aside to clear a path. He gave David a polite nod, and the other officer followed suit. Together they left the jet bridge. Now all eyes returned to David. He let out a long breath and turned to Sarah and Lucas. "I'd like to thank you both for treating us with courtesy. I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of this." Sarah's cheeks flamed with a mix of embarrassment and relief. "We're so sorry, sir," she murmured, feeling the weight of the moment. Lucas nodded, an apologetic look etched on his face. David's final gaze settled on Huxley. "Captain, I respect the duties of your position, but next time, adhere to proper procedure and remember that every passenger, no matter how they appear to you, deserves dignity." Then, with Marcus beside him, David stepped past the stunned pilot and into the terminal. In that charged silence, the once unyielding Huxley stood alone, grappling with the profound consequences of his actions. Word spread rapidly. By the next morning, an internal memo circulated within the airline's upper management about the incident on Flight AA-17. Several executives were already aware that David Collins, one of their largest shareholders, had been the subject of questionable treatment by a senior pilot. David didn't even have to file a complaint. The email and phone lines at corporate lit up with testimonies from other passengers, from Sarah Delgado, and from the Denver gate staff who witnessed the confrontation. The airline's VP of Operations, Donovan Reed, called an urgent meeting. Captain Huxley was summoned to the corporate office in Dallas. There, he sat in a windowless conference room, face pale, hands clasped nervously, as Donovan Reed, the chief legal officer Gerald Peterson, and two members of the Human Resources Department looked on. "Captain Huxley," began Donovan in a stern voice, "we have received several concerning reports regarding your behavior toward a passenger who also happens to be a major shareholder on Flight AA-17. We're here to investigate and hear your side of the story." Huxley rubbed his temples. He had hardly slept since the flight. "I was just doing my duty," he said weakly. "I had suspicions about fraudulent tickets." Gerald Peterson's gaze was icy. "We have multiple statements indicating you singled out Mr. Collins repeatedly without cause. Your actions led to embarrassment for one of our board members. Captain, we take these allegations very seriously." Huxley swallowed hard. His career was on the line, and he knew it. "I may have overstepped," he conceded, "but it wasn't personal." Donovan tapped a pen on the table. "Regardless of your intentions, your actions were inappropriate, potentially discriminatory, and damaging to our company's reputation. There will be disciplinary measures." For a moment, Huxley considered explaining away his biases or blaming stress, but he could see from their faces that no excuse would suffice. When the meeting concluded, he was placed on an indefinite suspension, pending a final decision from upper management. Meanwhile, David was in Los Angeles, attending the philanthropic events and business meetings on his schedule. Although he was outwardly composed, the incident still weighed heavily on his mind. He confided in Marcus one evening over dinner in Beverly Hills. "Part of me wants to push for Huxley's termination," David admitted, swirling a glass of sparkling water in his hand. "But another part of me thinks there might be a better way, something more constructive." Marcus leaned in. David, you've worked hard to implement diversity and inclusion initiatives. Firing the pilot might send a strong message, but is it the message that changes the culture? David nodded thoughtfully. I want accountability, but I also want to transform the system. We've already earmarked funds for improved cultural sensitivity training, mentorship programs, and recruitment from underrepresented communities. Maybe this incident can serve as a turning point. A few days later, David flew to Dallas, this time on a different flight, with no drama, to attend the board meeting. The entire board was abuzz with the story of David's confrontation with Captain Huxley. As soon as David took his seat, he saw the supportive looks from several board members, the curious glances from others. Gerald Peterson, the chief legal officer, opened the meeting with a review of the policies on passenger treatment and possible expansions of the diversity and sensitivity training program. After he finished, Donovan Reed spoke about the incident with Huxley. All eyes turned to David. He cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know about the unfortunate event on Flight AA-17. I won't rehash every detail. Suffice it to say, I was profiled based on my appearance, despite my status as a valid passenger and an owner. This is not just about me. It's about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race or background, feels safe and respected when they fly with us. He paused, letting the significance of his words settle. I propose we expand our diversity initiatives to include mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all employees, pilots, cabin crew, gate agents, and management alike. Furthermore, let's create a clear reporting mechanism for incidents of discrimination, ensuring swift accountability. A chorus of nods and muted applause followed his remarks. The CEO, Robert Lindsay, a silver-haired executive who had been supportive of David's ideas from the start, spoke next. David, your experience illustrates exactly why we need immediate reforms. I fully support your proposal. Let's vote on the expansions to our existing programs. The motion passed unanimously. As for Captain Huxley, the board decided to uphold his suspension. Whether he would return after completing an extensive training and evaluation process remained uncertain. A few weeks later, David received a message from Donovan Reed. Huxley is requesting a meeting with you. He says he wants to apologize. Do you want to speak with him? David pondered the request. Ultimately, he agreed. There was something about closure and offering a path to redemption that felt aligned with his values. They met at the airline's training center in Dallas. The building was a sprawling complex of simulators, classrooms, and administrative offices. David arrived in a modest, unassuming car, wearing business casual attire. Captain Huxley waited in a small conference room, shoulders slumped, the gold stripes gone from his uniform since he was technically still suspended. When David entered, Huxley stood but avoided eye contact. Mr. Collins, Huxley began, his voice shaky, I appreciate you agreeing to meet. I want to say I'm sorry. He paused, swallowing. I made assumptions about you. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment, and I deeply regret it. David studied him. Gone was the arrogant posture, the dismissive sneer. Instead, he saw a man grappling with shame and fear for his career. Captain Huxley, I believe in accountability. Do you? Huxley nodded, finally meeting David's eyes. Yes, I've been going through the training modules during my suspension. It's opened my eyes to things I never understood before. I realize how my actions could make someone feel like they don't belong, and I know that's wrong. David exhaled. Good. I don't relish seeing anyone's career ruined, but you have to recognize the gravity of what you did. If you return to the cockpit, you'll carry not just responsibility for passenger safety, but also the responsibility of representing this airline's values. Are you ready for that? The pilot hesitated, then answered resolutely, "I am." David considered it. "That decision isn't entirely mine. It's up to the board and the executive management. But I'll inform them of this conversation." A flicker of gratitude crossed Huxley's face. "Thank you," he said softly. David nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "We'll see where the chips fall, Captain. But I hope you've learned something from all this." Huxley bowed his head. "I have." In the weeks that followed, the airline rolled out a comprehensive diversity and sensitivity program. Every staff member, pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, corporate employees was required to participate. The program included historical education on discrimination in aviation, interactive workshops on bias, and robust policies for addressing concerns. Captain Huxley's fate hung in the balance. Eventually, the board agreed to reinstate him on a probationary status contingent on completing a rigorous training program and maintaining a spotless record. Some employees felt he should have been fired outright, but David believed in second chances, provided they were earned. In a press release, the airline publicly acknowledged a renewed commitment to diversity. David's role was not explicitly mentioned, but rumors swirled within industry circles about the philanthropic entrepreneur who owned a large share of the airline and had pushed for culture change from within. Sarah Delgado and Lucas Winfield became champions of the new initiative, sharing their experiences in training sessions. Sarah even recounted how she had tried to intervene during Flight A17, which resonated with many who often felt powerless under difficult leadership. Marcus, for his part, continued as David's right-hand man, assisting in both business ventures and philanthropic endeavors. The incident, though stressful, seemed to galvanize them both, pushing them to use the airline as a platform for broader social impact. Months passed, and the story of the pilot who asked a black man to prove his ticket slowly faded from public discourse. Yet it left a lasting imprint on those involved. Flight AA-17 had served as a catalyst for meaningful changes within the airline and, potentially, the wider industry. David Collins continued juggling his many responsibilities, tech investments, community programs, and board meetings. He found renewed purpose in ensuring that no passenger would ever experience what he did on that flight. He often reflected on how power could be wielded for personal vendettas or for systemic transformation. One sunny afternoon, as David prepared to board yet another flight, this time a short hop from Dallas to Chicago, he paused at the gate, scanning the crowd of travelers. Among them were different races, nationalities, families, solo adventurers. The diversity of humanity, all converging within the confines of an airplane, struck him as both beautiful and fragile. He offered a quiet prayer that day, that the promise of flying, of reaching new horizons, would remain open to all, free from prejudice, guided by respect, and championed by leaders with the integrity to do what was right. He handed over his boarding pass, the gate agent smiled, and he walked down the jet bridge without incident, just another passenger heading to new skies, his identity both ordinary and extraordinary. Equity soared high after that transformative flight. One man's stand against prejudice sparked a new corporate culture, bringing empathy and inclusion to the forefront. Employees embraced the changes, pilots flew with renewed respect, and countless passengers traveled with a deeper sense of belonging. These reforms weren't an overnight miracle, but a commitment to growth and accountability values that David championed with every board meeting and every philanthropic dollar. If we've learned anything from this intense drama, it's that a single confrontation can be a catalyst for progress. Now it's your turn to help these stories of triumph over bias reach more ears and hearts. Your voice matters in continuing this conversation. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can join us in celebrating moments of justice, empathy, and the power of unity. Keep flying high, stay strong, and let respect Guide your journey.